Hello again. There are around 60 species of eagle around the world, divided into different categories, including snake eagle, harpy eagle, sea eagle, true eagles or booted eagles, and a few others. Today's video is going to be a departure from the norm, because instead of concentrating on the skills and personal qualities needed to work with a particular species or group of species, we concentrate on the skills needed to deal with captive breeding of a very rare eagle, the Steller's sea eagle, which numbers around 700 birds in the wild, and the population is decreasing. They're only found in Russia, with a wintering population in Hokkaido in Japan. And we look at how difficult it is to breed the species in captivity. Today's guest is Charlie Heap, the director of the National Centre for Birds of Prey in Duncan Park in Helmsley, North Yorkshire, England. I began by asking Charlie how his own career had developed.
First of all, Charlie, can you explain what you do, where you work, how did your career develop?
I'm the director of the National Centre for Birds of Prey in Duncan Park in Helmsley in North Yorkshire. We are a specialist zoo specialising in day-flying birds of prey and owls. I've done this my whole life. Later on this year, it will be 40 years since I trained my first bird.
You're the only bird of prey centre in the UK with a pair of STELLER S SEA EAGLES. That's right, isn't it?
We're the only zoo in the UK who's breeding them.
Mm-hmm. And next time I contact you about STELLER S SEA EAGLES, I'll spell it properly.
I'm glad to hear it.
Charlie, how did the breeding of that species come about?
It's been a sort of long time in the making. We've had Stellers here since we first opened, and our first ones were a group of youngsters who came from the International Centre for Birds of Prey in Gloucestershire, from Jemima Parry-Jones, and she, I believe, was the UK first at breeding this particular species. However, they were all brothers and sisters. And so obviously they weren't going to form by themselves the nucleus of a future breeding pair, but I managed to borrow an unrelated female from a chap called Jerry Whitehouse Ted, who flew her for a little bit and was moving out to the Middle East to manage a place out there, and that ended up with our potential unrelated breeding pair. And it's taken a good while to be successful, but they're nailing it these days, and we're leaving them to it.
What have been the challenges, Charlie, with breeding the STELLER S SEA EAGLE?
They've in many ways, to be honest, been sort of almost the perfect example of how humans interfering and helping and doing something can actually make things better. So for the first 2 years that they laid, they sat absolutely fantastically and then ate the young as they hatched. And the reason why that was 2 years instead of 1 year is it's not a unique thing to happen with new parents. And so I thought the following year, maybe they'll get it right. And then they didn't get it right again. And so the year after that, we took action. They are a challenging species. They're very big. They're incredibly territorial. And so what we decided to do is we took both eggs after 10 days of natural incubation. But what we're also very aware of is that the female wouldn't come off the nest ledge when we're going to take the eggs, and she fights her corner. And in circumstances like that, there is a real chance that she's going to break her own eggs. And we thought if she breaks the first clutch of eggs after 10 days of incubation, she should recycle and lay another clutch. And we can have a think about things and maybe refine techniques. As it happened, we managed to get the eggs from her. We swapped them for dummy eggs. We incubated them. We hatched them. At 10 days old, one of the chicks went back with her. And the other one was foster reared by a pair of steppe eagles down in Gloucestershire. We've gradually sort of moved along to getting her to do it. So last year was the first year she hatched and raised, but just one. We took the other egg and we hatched and raised that one. This year we left both eggs with her and she's hatched and raised them both, which is great. We've given her the opportunity to learn how to be a mum.
Why is that 10 days of incubation critical, Charlie?
The feeling that there is that in the early days of incubation, one of the first things that starts happening is a network of blood vessels spreads through the membrane that lies just underneath the eggshell. And those blood vessels are what effectively become the developing embryo's lungs. They absorb oxygen that moves through the porous eggshell. It's thought that natural incubation leads to a stronger formation of blood vessels, which interestingly really comes to count right at the end of incubation, because it's particularly when the chick starts to need a lot more oxygen, because it's a chick, not just a little cluster of cells, and also it aids in hatching too. You tend to get better hatch rate. I would love there to be some proper figures on this, and what we really need to figure out is why is natural incubation better? What are they doing that's better than what we're doing?
I've read 2 pieces of work on incubation. I read the Tomcade falcon propagation and understanding birds of prey, the relevant chapter in that. Is there anything else more up to date?
Any scientific work, it only becomes valid if there's a large number of eggs. And you don't just need to incubate the eggs in the very best way. You need to try a bit of a sort of spread of different humidities, different temperatures, and inevitably you're going to learn more from your failures than your successes. And the danger of doing that with birds of prey, that means there's going to be a load of eggs that you are on purpose going to foul up their incubation in order for you to learn as to why that is the wrong thing to do. And trying to convince people to do that with their eggs is going to be a challenge.
Charlie, you mentioned that one of the challenges that you face is going into the enclosure and the female becomes territorial and there's a real risk of breaking the eggs. How do you get around that situation?
We have doorways onto the nest ledges of all of the eagle aviaries, and so, I mean, most eagles are pretty easy to deal with, because most of them, the moment you just tap lightly on the door, they're off the nest. And if they're off for 10 or 15 seconds, and most of them are off for easily that long, you can swap real eggs for dummy eggs. You can swap dummy eggs for chicks or whatever. The Stellers are different about that, is that she just stands up and she, with her feet either side of the eggs, and she faces me, and it's a sort of, come on if you think you're hard enough sort of thing. It is not my favorite thing to do at all. But we have a sort of designated soft broom that I open the door and I put it in the middle of her chest and I push her backwards off the nest ledge. And I've then got as long as it takes for her to get herself back on the nest ledge to do what I need to do. Unfortunately, the design of the sort of corridor inside means there isn't actually a bit of floor outside the Steller's door. I'm standing on a ladder, which just makes it all a little bit more precarious. But I have somebody behind me on the ladder, so I can pass eggs down to them and they can pass chicks up to me, and then the door can be shut And in fairness to Inawashi, the breeding female, she's very good. She comes back to the nest ledge the moment that she sees, you know, that all of a sudden her eggs have hatched and turned into 10-day-old youngsters in the previous 15 seconds. She goes straight down onto her hock. She pulls her feet up. She shuffles over them and tucks them under and starts brooding them. She is a fantastic parent.
Are those more or less the only two problems with this particular species, the Stellar sea eagle, the territoriality on the nest and the 10 days incubation?
The 10 days incubation is a common thing for all eggs, to be honest. I think they all benefit from that, from some natural incubation. Hatch wise, the rules for helping an egg hatch are impossible, because the rule is you mustn't go in and help too early, and you mustn't go in and help too late either. But when the right time is, you don't really know. There's little techniques you can use, but at the end of the day, you're taking your egg's life into your hands, basically. When they've done an external pip, so there's often, it's just a crack, it can be just a raised portion of egg, which is when they're starting to sort of hatch out. They've already done an internal pip, which is when they pierce the membrane across the egg and they fill their lungs with the air that's in the airspace, and that's when they start calling. And that is normally the time when that's how you know that they've internally pipped. You then can position the egg in such a way by looking at the shape of the air cell that they're going to externally pip on the top of the egg, so they're facing up. So if there's any liquid in the egg, they're not likely to sort of breathe it in or anything. One of the things there can be is if a bird knocks a small hole in an egg, and the membrane can potentially then drop from that sort of air. It's not supported by the shell anymore. It can drop onto the hatching chick's nose and can dry on there and can potentially smother them. And so to stop that happening, this was last thing at night. I just made the hole, instead of just being a little tiny microscopic hole, I made it about 1 millimeter big, and I tore out that little millimeter circle of membrane, so I knew it was going to be okay, and I could see the beak moving around in there. Unfortunately, the physical and biological process of eggs hatching is fairly brutal for the chick, because one of the things that makes them get a move on with hatching is that as those blood vessels in that membrane, the sort of external lungs, as it were, start to die off and start to close down, the blood pressure falls in them, the blood stops flowing in them, and the bird starts breathing air instead of using these external lungs. It then starts to run out of oxygen inside of its own egg, and it starts to suffocate. And it's that suffocation that makes them externally hatch. And the downside of helping them hatch is they're not suffocating from lack of oxygen. And so they lack that stimulus to make them hatch naturally.
How many days have you got before they imprint on you if you have to hand raise them?
We've never hand reared one before, so we leave them with the parents. There's a couple of reasons for that. There's a number of issues with flying imprinted eagles. I can't help think that it is cheating a little bit. You're doing away with that real challenge of taking a bird that wants to get away from you and convincing it to come towards you, because imprinted birds just want to be with you all of the time. However, from a conservation perspective, imprinting is to be avoided, because effectively it means that bird's almost is most unlikely to ever breed naturally itself. And so it effectively becomes a sort of genetic dead end, and then won't be part of a sort of future breeding program. The other issue that always is with imprinted eagles, with falconers flying them, is that everybody wants to imprint their own eagle. The part of imprinting becomes such a part of the whole experience of having the eagle, and it means if that eagle ever needs to be found another home, nobody wants it. I do have an imprint Stellar Sea Eagle. She's here on loan, and she is a complete delight. She's weakening my feelings on the hand rearing eagles. Parent raised Stellar Sea Eagles can be very, very challenging to fly. They fly really nicely. We've had some truly amazing Stellar Sea Eagles on the flying team here. However, they get incredibly nervous. They get very frightened about unusual situations. The unusual situations don't have to be very unusual. I had a bird last year, bred here, raised by his own parents, a couple of years old. He sat on a piece of grass whilst I was flying in that he hadn't sat on before. And just because he'd sat on some unfamiliar grass, he was out for 3 nights and 4 days. We don't stop when we've got a bird out. So if it's light and there's a bird out, this person sat underneath the bird. That is particularly important with a bird the size of a Steller sea eagle. You know, there's a sort of public panic sort of thing. I don't think he's any danger to anybody, but I'm aware he looks like he's a danger to somebody. And that's me who does that, because it was my bird and I was flying him. There was no getting away from it. It was my job. So I had a really dreadful few days, very stressful indeed. And he came back and sat on the standoff barrier outside the vulture aviary when we were having coffee one morning, and tried to get into the vultures so he could have breakfast. So he came to me, and that was the end of that. But I wanted to try an imprint to see if that made a difference with this being frightened of the whole world. And it does. Imprints are not scared of the whole world. You know, when I first started, imprints were sort of feared, and it was definitely something to be avoided. And imprints would just scream their heads off and have appalling manners and be mantling all the time, and would often be very aggressive towards people. And in fairness, I think it's the big falcon breeders who have refined imprinting and how to do it, and how to get a bird that is a joy to be around.
What's the generation period, Charlie?
I think the male was 7 when he when they first laid. Eagle breeding is not for the impatient. Jemima Stellers, she had them for 17 years before they bred.
Is there a European breeding management plan for Stellers now? Is there a management plan at all? Is anybody officiated over official agreements between zoos for them?
I'm not quite sure how it stands at the moment. Ours are part of the I'm not sure if it's a species survival program or a stud book. They're all a little bit the same as each other. The idea is that there's a coordinator who looks at the population of a species on a continental level, and acts to pair birds up, or animals of whatever species, to get the very best chances of maximizing production with good genetic variety. The slight challenge, well, maybe it's a massive challenge, is that the coordinator is one of the curators at Moscow Zoo, and doing anything with Russia these days is a bit of a no-go. I haven't even had an email from her for the last year. I don't know, are we even allowed to get emails from Russia these days? I don't know. Their entire breeding range is within Russia. The only other places where Steller sea eagles in the wild occur is in the winter on Hokkaido in northern Japan, where they migrate to spend the winter. And we did some work with a chap called Richard Sale, Dr. Richard Sale, a few years ago, who is a fantastic guy and a really preeminent bird of prey scientist. He's just written a fantastic book on peregrine falcons as well. He did one on Steller sea eagles, and we did some work with him doing flight data. So our trained Stellers were flying with data loggers on to. And most of his work was obviously done in Russia on wild birds, and his feeling is that there is every chance that within the next few years they're declining so quickly, and the threats against them are potentially so significant that a breed and release scheme could be appropriate. Unfortunately, with the situation in Ukraine, I can't see that coming to pass. The problem with these breeding release schemes is they have to come at the end of any conservation program. The big question that needs answering is why are the birds declining? And if the reason's still there, then you mustn't release any more. You've got to get rid of the reason. We are not big enough as an organization to run a release program. We need somebody else to do that bit. And if I could donate Steller sea eagles to that release program, I would do it in the blink of an eye. But it needs to be set up by somebody else. Somebody else needs to pay for it is the big thing. And then there needs to be proper monitoring. You obviously can't just turf them out. You need a proper soft release situation putting up. You need to be monitoring the young, so you know if it's all working and going really well.
On that subject, where do you see Steller's sea eagle conservation going in the next 10 years? Is it going to be concentrating on captive breeding? Is it going to be more field work?
Then probably needs to be more field work. There needs to be more in situ conservation as well. And so stuff actually on the ground, looking at the threats and mitigating the threats. Unfortunately, the world still survives on oil and gas, and Russia absolutely still survives on oil and gas. Conservation is always better off starting in situ. That is when it sort of comes down to it, is the only place where it really matters. However, that's not our role. Our role is, if there is a role for us to play, is to breed Steller sea eagles so long as we've got good homes for them to go to. I'm going to be honest, there is getting to the point where there's a shortage of good homes for them to go to, that they have to be with somebody who has the knowledge of the facilities to care for them. And they need to be in the situation where they can be called into breeding programs if that's needed.
Anything you'd like to add, Charlie?
I don't think so. I think we've covered quite a lot there, haven't we?
I think we have. Charlie, Director of the National Centre for Birds of Prey. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. It's been fascinating. Charlie Heap.
Thanks very much.